Welcome everyone to class number 20 of our ongoing series in the encyclopedia, the halakhic encyclopedia of the S'dei Chemed. And we are in volume 8, Ches. The section is Pa'as HaSadeh, Klolim Mareches HaGimel, Siman Vav. And that would otherwise be on page Aleph Tafresh with Beis 1612, and that's the opposite, direct opposite of the page which is numbered 3222. So that would be page 3223. We are up to the 15th subsection in this general section, number 6, which is under the letter Gimel, which is Goy. We're discussing various different things about Goy, about the non-Jew. How Jewish law and Jewish rules, how and when and if they apply to the non-Jew. So we're up to topic number 15. Some of them were extremely lengthy, and others were brief, and then some in between. So right now we have two really short ones, which are pretty much going to be almost just references, and he's not going to really say that much about the topic. But then today we're going to be focusing on number 17 after we get through the two short ones of Tes Vav 15 and Tes Zayin 16. So on the left-hand column, second paragraph, again on page Aleph Tafresh with Beis, opposite 3222. Chaim, we have established the Mitzri Neherag al pi Eidechad v'Karov. Now, in this case, it says Mitzri, which means an Egyptian. As we've discussed numerous times in various different classes, for different reasons, the non-Jew is referred to by different titles. Some of them are, as we've explained, because of censorship. However, in Talmud and in Talmudic literature, you'll find different expressions for their various different reasons. Sometimes it makes a big difference what we're calling him, and oftentimes it doesn't really make a difference. It means any non-Jew, whether he is categorically one who is observing the 7 Noachite commandments, he's a Noachite, he's a Ben Noach, or whether he's not. It oftentimes it doesn't matter. So here we're referring to a Mitzri, which is an Egyptian. That's a very specific type of a nationality. That's a human being who is of the Egyptian nationality. That's one nation out of 70. It's not limited to the Mitzri. Even though it says Mitzri, Egyptian, this applies to any non-Jew. Now, the question is, being that a non-Jew can be put to death by the court based on the testimony of either one witness or even a relative. Now, the point is, in Jewish law, as far as a Jew is concerned, in order for a Jew to not only be put to death, but in order for the Jew to receive any punishment, or for that matter, to be obligated in anything, for it to be admissible testimony in the Jewish court of law, basically, for the most part, it needs to be 2 witnesses, 2, and in quotations, kosher witnesses, 2 proper and fit witnesses that by Jewish law are fit to testify. And in order to be a proper witness, there's certain criteria. One, it has to be a Jew who's testifying. To testify against a Jew, whether it's in a monetary case, a civil case, whether it's an issue between man and God, whether it's to give them financial punishment, or whether it's to give them the flogging, the 39 lashes, or whether it's the death penalty, it doesn't matter. For the most part, it has to be Jews that are testifying. It has to be male Jews. It has to be that they are adults, which means over the age of 13, but as we've discussed in a previous class, actually that's not exactly enough. They have to actually have physical maturity, signs of physical maturity, and over 13. They can't be related, closely related, to each other, nor to any of the parties that are involved, whether it's testifying against one person or whether it's a dispute between two people. So those, and of course the person cannot be categorically a rasha, a wicked person, a transgressor. So you have a lot of criteria in order for a person to be fit and eligible to be a witness. So even if this person is most trusted, and the example brought down is Moses and Aaron cannot testify, even though who can doubt Moses and Aaron? Those two brothers are the most trustworthy people to ever walk the face of the earth. They would never falsely testify. They're brothers, can't testify together. That's the way it is. And you need two witnesses, as I said. Now, as far as the laws of Bnei Noach, that's not so. In the Talmud, and then this is actually brought down as a legal ruling in the Rambam in Maimonides, in the laws of Melachim, laws of kings, where he discusses over there the Shev Mitzvahs Bnei Noach, the 7 Noachide commandments. One witness is enough to testify, and it could be a relative. Having said that, nistapek rav echad, one rabbi, one authority of Jewish law has a doubt. Huva b'shaylos v'tshuvas bris Yaakov Lifshitz b'Chaim Siman Chaf, and it's brought down in a responsa of a rabbi, and he tells exactly which section in his responsa in his book. Question that is brought up: Im nerag b'hoidois atzmoy, can a ben Noach be put to death for transgressing one of the Shev Mitzvahs Bnei Noach by self-admittance? In other words, the rules are not the same as by a Jew. So we know that a Jew can't walk into the Jewish court and said, I have a confession to make. I purposely, as he says, God forbid, murdered someone. No mistake, no accident, it was malicious, it was intentional. And I want to do teshuvah, I would like to return to God, I want to make amends, I want to repent. And I know that part of it is that I have to be put to death, so I'm ready. Please do what you need to do. And the Jewish court will say, have a nice day. You don't believe me? It's not whether we believe you or not, that's irrelevant. You cannot testify against yourself. Guy comes in and he says, I desecrated the Shabbos, the Sabbath. We don't accept your testimony, etc. Now, it's not only for a capital offense, for anything. So now the question becomes like this. Since the rules of witnesses and testimony are different when it comes to a ben Noach, as we find that it could be one witness and it could be a relative. So what about this case? If a ben Noach comes to the court and admits that he transgressed willingly and knowingly, intentionally, Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach, which is a capital offense, can he be put to death based on his own self-admittance? So there's a doubt. The yesh loymar, we can explain, we can say, that fact which when it comes to a Jew, a Yisrael, self-admittance doesn't work, is not admissible in the court. Why? What's the reason? What's the logic? Why can a Jew not testify against himself? Well, the explanation is because, in the words of the Talmud, a person is close to themselves. There's nobody closer to yourself than yourself. There's nobody who's more biased than yourself. So the person is as subjective as can be, more so than a sibling, than a parent, than a spouse, than a child. I mean, it's himself, okay? And since a relative can't testify, so a person is as related to himself as can be. So if that's the reason, the cave and the mitzri neragal pikarov, and since the non-Jew can be put to death based on the testimony of a witness, his own brother can testify against him, and it would be accepted. Therefore, logically, he could be put to death based on his own testimony, because the whole reason why we don't accept testimony of oneself against oneself is because of the closeness that he has to himself. Well, by the Ben Noach, that rule doesn't apply, so then it shouldn't apply, even to this extent. So that's one way of looking at it, that it's different. Just like a relative could testify, so too one can testify against themselves. And the genius, the author over here, he goes on at great length. And then again, the S'dei Chemed, as he often does, he is making a reference to himself in a different section where he brings down this whole discussion. And I too, says the S'dei Chemed, the author here, I too, he's speaking very humbly, me the impoverished, meaning intellectually he's putting himself down, even though he's the greatest genius for having all this information without computers and without many of the books. Incredible, as we've discussed in the earlier classes when we started this section. But in a very humble way, he says, and me, the poor, impoverished individual, I also wrote a little bit about this. So it doesn't give us a clear ruling, at least not here. But he does only bring up the side that it would be acceptable, and therefore a Ben Noach could be put to death based on his own admittance. Now, for example, the secular law, which isn't necessarily in line with the Torah law for Bnei Noach, but the secular law in this country, in the United States, I believe that pretty much across the board, self-admittance is admissible and it's accepted, and whatever the penalty would be. And if someone admits to committing any murder, any crime whatsoever, then they may be more lenient in the punishment because he pleaded guilty. But there you have it. Pleaded guilty, pleaded innocence. In Jewish law, technically, for the most part, I'm speaking of general terms, what the person claims and pleads is irrelevant. It's irrelevant. We need clear proof. We need testimony. What you say is irrelevant. You say you did steal, you didn't steal. Well, so that was not really the best example because that would be sort of an exception. But if the person said, oh, I did desecrate the Shabbos, or I did worship idolatry, or I did commit adultery, for the most part, it's irrelevant what you say. We need to have two proper witnesses. by the Bnei Noach, it doesn't work that way. And I think that in the United States, that is how it works as well. If a person walks in to the police station and he says, I'm turning myself in, I just committed such and such a crime, I think they would book him, and then he would go through the process. And as I said, I don't know, but I'm guessing that they may be more lenient with him for being forthcoming, but they wouldn't say, well, sorry, we don't believe you, or we don't accept your testimony, go bring us proof. Anyway, all right, next piece. Tes Zayin, 16. Im ben noyach nenash al ha'ubrim v'chein im harages atreifa v'chein harages hanefel oy es ben shmoyne chadashim shiyatzachai la'olam. Now, one of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach is the prohibition against murder. It is prohibited to take someone's life. Now, the question becomes, is it a capital punishment? Do we actually kill the person for, and he gives a list of people which, of course, it's forbidden to kill them, but is it still the death penalty? One is a ubar, which means the unborn fetus. In other words, an abortion. 2, someone who is terminally ill that is guaranteed that they're going to die within a relatively short period of time. Another one would be, well, we have the law that, according to the Talmud, in order for the child to survive, he needs to have been born after 9 months of pregnancy, or at least in the 9th month, or alternatively, if it's an early birth, in the 7th month. The 8th month, the child will not survive. That's how it is according to the Talmud. 7 months is fine. That's a premature birth, and it could be a very healthy birth, and everything could be fine. 9 is full term. That's for sure fine. 8, for some reason, he will not survive. And how to get around the modern day biology and medicine. So I think that the way we say it, even in Talmudic terms, is if the child was born after 8 months and he does survive, it's sort of like he was really born after, he's really a 7th month old, a preemie. He's really 7 months. And he just didn't actually come out till the 8th month. But it's not that it was an 8th month pregnancy. It's like we don't count that extra month somehow. So again, how to make the difference, clinically speaking, I don't know. But traditionally, an 8th month baby will not survive. So what happens if the 8th month baby was born as it was a live birth and someone killed him? So all these examples are not regular, healthy in the sense of living people. The treifa, the terminally ill individual, is definitely, naturally going to die within at least the next few months. So if someone killed him, did he really kill a living human being? And then, of course, the whole controversy about a fetus, about aborting the child. So all those cases, ayin b'mashevesi b'sif katan gimel b'diber maskul v'ine b'pirim magadim b'diber maskul k'fi hanireh. So he says, take a look at what we wrote in subsection 3. So he's just making a reference to it without going into it, or without saying anything, as a matter of fact, just giving us a reference to back there. Yeah. All of those cases are still forbidden. But the question is the person put to death for it? Now that brings us to the next part. All right. Yud Zayin 17. Now, for the Jew, there is one of the 613 commandments of the 613, of all of the mitzvahs, all the commandments, is the prohibition against not keeping one's word. Loy yachel dvaroi. One should not profane or not keep their word. If someone made a vow, they have to keep it. And there's a concept of annulling a vow, but otherwise, the person made a vow, they have to keep it. And now we're going to discuss how does that apply to a ben noyach? It's not one of the 7, is it? And if so, why would it apply and how does it apply and so on? So let's see it inside. Left-hand column, last paragraph. Right about in the middle of the page. In ben noyach mitzuve alo yachil dvaroi b'neder uvishvua. Whether a ben noyach, a non-Jew, is commanded against not keeping his word of a vow or an oath. Tziyanti banitpas b'marachazu ois hen sivkot memalef. Lion ben Nazir daf samach alef b'teisves diva maschil hanicha. So he says, I already referenced, and he tells us exactly where he referenced it, to take a look in the commentary of the Tosfos, in Tractate of Nazir, Uvemishnah lamelech ba'asir milchus malachim b'dibar maskil v'da shema shetirtzu, and in one of the main commentaries on Maimonides, in the 10th chapter of the Laws of Kings, where it discusses the Sheva Mitzvahs, and he tells us exactly which paragraph, which section there. And in one of the great books written on a section of the Code of Jewish Law called Avnei Miluyim, right at the beginning, Toirev Hadvarim, the main point of all of these references, what do they all say about this? Who, the Rabbi Seinu HaTosfos Sham, it is that our rabbis, the authors of the Tosfos, the commentators, Kasvu, they wrote, the ben noyach einoi b'lo yachil dvaroi. Bottom line, the gist of it is that a ben noyach is not transgressing if he breaks his vow. Umarana Mishnah Lamelech Tzolal B'mayim Adirim, and our great leader, the sage, the Mishnah Lamelech, which he referenced, he uses an expression, dived very deeply into great waters, meaning he went very, very deep into this. Shemidivrei HaTosfos u'Perakamad Avodah Dafei Ahahi de Mechusar Ever Shasu Libnei Noyach, and referring to the commentator of the Tosfos in the Tractate of Avodah Zarah, Muchach, it comes out very clear, it's proven, Desavri Divnei Noyach Isnehu B'lo Yachil, that they hold, that Tosfos holds, that Bnei Noyach are in this category. They are commanded, they are transgressing if they don't keep their word, their vow. V'tom al zeh, and the Mishnah Lamelech asks on what the Tosfos say. He is bewildered by it. Why? What's his question? De'ech yitochin, how could it be sheyehei bal yachel b'ma shenoidrim lahakriv b'bama shalahem? How could it be that a ben noyach will be transgressing of not keeping his vow when he made a neder, a vow, to bring a sacrifice on the altar, on their altar? V'oid,
Da'af, b'mashenoidim l'hakrim v'es hamikdash, min olem d'israbu b'nei noach l'bal yachil v'chulu.
And even if the Ben Noach is not bringing a sacrifice on his own altar, which is permissible, even if he wants to bring it in the holy temple, our temple, which is permissible, now we've discussed in the past, the only sacrifice that a Ben Noach may bring is the oila, the burnt offering. So if he makes a neder, a vow, just like a Jew would do, that he is going to bring this sacrifice, why do we assume that the same rule that applies to a Jew would apply to him? For a Jew, if a Jew says, they take upon themselves and they say, I hereby am making a neder, a vow, to bring a korban oila. Well then, if the Jew doesn't, he's transgressing. And Jewish law even gives us a time frame. After how much time is he transgressing? When can he no longer say, I will, I plan on it, I am going to? He doesn't have to bring the day that he says it. So it talks about it. And he has a certain time frame. Until then, he's not transgressing yet. Once that time goes by, he has transgressed. Why in the world should we include the Ben Noach in that same rule? Surely not if it's on their own altar, and even in the Beis HaMikdash. So that's the question of the Mishnah Lamelech. And then he brought down the words of the Tosfos, the first Tosfos that we mentioned, the one in Nazir, not the one in Avodah Zarah. Shadas Sifsei Sehem, that the opinion of their lips, meaning their clear opinion, Barar Milaloi, is extremely clear. The lav de lo yachel, that the prohibition, the negative commandment of not keeping your vow, leisei beven noyach, does not exist, does not apply to a ben noyach. Hebech memashenire b'mashikos v'avodah zarah hanal, which is the opposite of what it seems that Tosfos says in Avodah Zarah. So it seems like we have a dispute between two Tosfos, which, as we've discussed in a previous class, is not really a problem. It's only a problem if it's the same author who seemingly is contradicting himself from what he writes in one place to what he writes somewhere else. Like the great commentator Rashi, if he was to say something in one tractate, and in a different tractate in the Talmud, he is to say something different, that would be a problem, and then we would deal with it. And then, of course, we'd explain what the difference is and why he's not contradicting himself, even though it appears that he is. Same thing with the Rambam, Maimonides. If he makes one statement in one set of the laws, and then somewhere completely different, far away from those laws, he says something else which seems to contradict his ruling back there. That's a problem, and that comes up, and we deal with it, and then we explain the difference between the two. When it comes to Tosfos, since Tosfos is not one person, Tosfos means addition. It's a compilation of sages from a certain era, and it's in addition to the primary commentator, which is Rashi. And many of the Tosfos, actually, a number of them, are Rashi's own grandchildren, and many others. So, the only problem you would have, theoretically, and I can't think of such an example offhand, sometimes Tosfos doesn't give us any names of who is saying it, and oftentimes it does. So if you have the same member of the Tosfos stating one thing, and in a different place, it has the same name, and he says something contradictory to that, that's a problem. But as long as it doesn't say a name, then we can assume it's a machlokes, it's an argument between Tosfos and Tosfos, because it's not the same person. Okay. So, what he's suggesting is that Tosfos, in tractate of Nazir, holds that there's no prohibition of loy yachel dvaroi, that a non-Jew is not permitted to not keep his vow. No such prohibition. Whereas the Tosfos in Avodah Zarah holds that there is the prohibition, just like it applies to a Jew. it applies to the non-Jew as well. Okay.
The Kosav, and then he writes, L'chalek, he wants to make a distinction. Bein nedarim l'shvuos,
between vows and oaths. Basically, a neder is if a person takes upon themselves to do something, like to bring a sacrifice.
and a shavua is
Basically, a vow either to abstain from something or stating a fact. Like in the court, when the person has to take an oath, that would be a shivua. So he wants to make the difference for Bnei Noach between a neder and a shivua. And thus explaining that Tosfos is not arguing with Tosfos, but there are two different points there that they're focusing on.
v'soif dvarav
So at the end of his whole discussion,
masik. He concludes that davar tzarich Talmud.
that we need to really delve into it, that we have to learn it. It's not simple. He wants to suggest that there's a difference between the two different types of a vow and an oath, but at the end he says we need to really understand.
V'hagoyin havnei miluim hevi teirif divir Mishnah Lamelech.
Now, the above mentioned Avnei Miluim, he brings down the main point of the Mishnah Lamelech. The Kosav and the Avnei Miluim then wrote
Shenira loy barur, that it appears to him clear that bebenoyach leka lo yachel v'loy moitzes vasechas ishmor, that when it comes to a benoyach, there is no prohibition of not keeping his word. And he quotes two different verses. Ella da'amira legavoya hu kinyan gomer kimasira lehedyot.
because we have a rule. When a Jew says that he's going to bring, donate, give something tangible to God, to the Holy Temple, by saying so, it's tantamount to, if it were to be a regular person, not something consecrated like the temple, as if he already gave it. In other words, yes, of course, it's proper to keep your word. No one's arguing with that. But we're asking very technically, at what point does it become a crime? At what point is the person actually sinning? Not just, oh, it's not nice. We're not talking about nice. We're very technical here, and we're talking about in a court of law. So, if one person tells someone else, I will sell you this particular item. You promise? I will sell you this item. Guy says, okay, thanks. I'll be back tomorrow with the money. Guy comes back. Sorry, sold. What? Can't do that. You owe me such an item. I owe you? I only had one, and I sold it. But you said you're going to sell it to me. So, it's not nice, but the potential buyer can't do anything about it. The sale was legal. Right? So basically, words in this case are worthless and they're empty. However, if they actually made some type of a kinyan, which we discussed in a previous class, some type of a acquisition, and there's all sorts of different ways how that applies between one Jew and another Jew, that's a different story.
that would sort of be if you wrote a document and you signed a document. That's different. Signing a document, then it's a contract. You can't just break a contract. There are consequences. There are more concrete rules than just breaking your word. So, the rule for Jews is simply verbally saying that you're going to give a sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Holy Temple, is the same as if you would have actually given or sold something to a fellow. Okay? Now, that having been said, V'im ben noyach nodar lahavi karban, havi choiv gamur. And therefore, if a ben noyach made a neder, he vowed to bring a sacrifice, well then, that's an absolute must. He now has an obligation. V'goyvim menachasim mishubadim. And for that matter, you can actually, if you can't afford it, we could take from his property that sort of has a lien on it, his property that's in the hands of someone else, but it's meshubad, it is connected to him. Leman damar shibuda deiraisa, uvakasa bishtar v'chulu. According to the opinion that says that this concept of property, real estate, being connected to the original owner is biblical, because that itself is a whole discussion. Basically, if someone sells their property and before they sold their property, real estate, they owed money to people. So that property, since the person or the people that the money is owed to could have come after the person, and if he didn't have any cash or any movable items that are worth the money, they could have taken away his real estate, his field. So the fact that he sold a field after he already owes money to these people, now the collectors can go to these buyers and take by force. The court will enforce it to take the property. But of course, if it was sold before he owed the money, then they can't. So that's basically called meshubad, that it is subdued, or it is, there's a lien on it, sort of. So let's say like this. Sunday, Mr. A borrows $1,000 from Mr. B. Okay? So now Mr. A owes $1,000 to Mr. B. When he borrowed that money, he had a field that was worth $1,000. So Mr. B, the lender, has security, because he knows that even if he can't pay up when the date comes, let's say 30 days from now, when he can't pay up, he can always take his field as payment. That's pretty solid. That's real estate. Now Monday, Mr. A sold his field for $1,000 to Mr. C. He doesn't have that field anymore. And then of course he spent the $2,000 that borrowed and the money that he made on the sale. And now comes the payback date to Mr. B. Sorry, I don't have anything. Mr. B can go to Mr. C, if you're still following, and he could take away that field. Because at the time that Mr. B lent the money, that field belonged to the borrower. That is called mishubad. If, however, the timetable would have been different, and Mr. A would have sold the field
He owned a field worth $1,000. On Sunday, he sold it to Mr. C, got $1,000. Then on Monday, he goes to Mr. B, he borrows $1,000. And now he doesn't have any money afterwards when it comes time to pay up. Then Mr. B cannot bother Mr. C at all. And that field has nothing to do with this debt. Simple enough. So what happens if a person made a vow to bring a sacrifice? And now can't afford it. He can't afford the animal. So because it was not just a word or a vow to buy or to sell or to do something towards his fellow man, but it was actually to God. Therefore, his word alone is as good as an actual legal transaction. And that's why we would be able to take away, to sell his real estate, and with that money, to buy an animal, and then to give it to him to bring as a sacrifice. And he says that would apply to a ben noach as well.
Ein sham divrei kodshoy. V'isagti ata. And then says the S'dei Chemed, I now got hold of, and we've had this expression before, where he writes with excitement that he's got hold of a new book that he didn't have until then. He now received Sefer Mishkanois Haroyim Lididi Agoyin Av Bezdin Kilas Niazov Yishmem Tzur V'chaskim. All right, so a friend of his, which is a rabbi, the rabbi in a certain community, the author of a book called Mishkanois Haroyim, he says, I got hold of that book. And I saw over there in the beginning of section 47, Denokit Bepshitus, that over there, this author writes very simply, that there isn't any prohibition of Bal Yachil, of not keeping your word when it comes to a Ben Noach, unlike the Jew. As the Tosfos in Tractate Nazir wrote, that it does not apply to a Ben Noach. The Kosav, and this Mishkanois Haroyim wrote, L'chadesh al pizeh, he wants to innovate based on that it doesn't apply. The Ben Noach loy mahani she'ela, that for Ben Noach, borrowing wouldn't work. The darshinan, because we deduce from the verse, we say kol sheyeshnoi belo yachel yeshnoi b'achirim miyachelin loy uben noach the leisei b'al yachel leisei b'sheila. Meaning, he wants to suggest, which is pretty extreme, that for Bnei Noach, there's no concept of borrowing. You can only buy. You can't borrow someone else's property. And that's because, how do we know the whole concept of one person, by a Jew, being able to borrow something of someone else? Well, we learn it out from Lo Yachil. So anybody who is warned, is prohibited from profaning his own words, so then others can as well. And since he said that a Ben Noach doesn't fall into the category, there is no prohibition of lo yachil, of not keeping your word. Therefore, the whole idea of borrowing doesn't apply. In the parentheses, the nafkalon midiyuka, because we learn it out from a nuance. Meaning that others can. But then the S'dei Chemed is asking, he says, this is very doubtful. Why? We have a tradition. We cannot make up our own inferences from the verses. In other words, what we can do is logic. We can explain things logically and say, logic mandates this conclusion or that conclusion, and go back and forth using logic. You can't use verses to make up your own interpretation, because that is part of the tradition. We have the written rules, and we have all of the oral tradition of how to interpret or what the written word is hinting to. You can't make up your own interpretation to the written word. And that seems to be what he's doing here, he says. Then he's telling us the S'dei Chemed, exactly where to look it up in his S'dei Chemed, where he writes over there in his long list of rules of how to make rulings in Jewish law. V'shakil v'tari oid, and he then goes back and forth more, lo yichiach, to prove that borrowing does not work by bnei noach. And he needed that to answer the inquiry of the rabbi that was asking the question, namely, he says, how in the world are we, Jews, in the Holy Temple, allowed to sacrifice an animal, a sacrifice that was brought by a non-Jew as a burnt offering? How can we accept it? Why not? Nechush, let us be concerned. Dilma, perhaps, ischil alei. Maybe he borrowed it. Vavichulin bazara. And since borrowing doesn't work, that means to say that it can't be consecrated, and that means that it's a sin of bringing an unholy, unconsecrated animal into the Holy Temple as a korban. That's not allowed. Any animal that's brought into the Holy Temple as a sacrifice has to be that it was made holy. How is it made holy? Well, by someone saying, I'm going to bring this as a sacrifice. Fine. But if it's not his to do that, then he can't. So since a Jew can borrow, and a Jew could say, can I borrow this animal of yours, and I owe you another animal like this? Okay, that's fine. But if a ben noach can't do that for this reason, so how can we ever accept the sacrifice? Let's be concerned that maybe it's not really his. And got a problem. Ayin Shom, Gam Besifroi Nachlo Yisrael Besimen Yud Taf Yud Aleph Amud Alud Ois Yud Gimel Hiskir Dvarav Shemishknes Haroim Shebesimen Hanal. Then he says, also take a look at another sefer where he brings down all of this. V'yisi Tameya Olav. And I was really bewildered on this ruling of his. Dai kol raz lo anislei, v'nelo mimenu dein ze pashut deleka bal yachal bebenoyach. Well, being that nothing is hidden from him, this great author, and yet he didn't seem to know, it seemed to be hidden from him, that it's not so simple that there isn't bal yachal by a ben noach. Maybe there is. That's the whole discussion. Maybe the prohibition of not keeping your word does apply to a ben noach. And he probably has the book of Mishnah Lamelech that we started off quoting. And I think Ra'isi Shemazkir Be'zeh Mokayman. The S'dei Chemed says, I think I saw him mention different things from the Mishnah Lamelech on different topics, which means he has the book. Until I saw, it tells exactly where in his book he wrote, Shebesefer Kuf Samech Rashak Zal Kinas Soifrim, that in the book called Kina Seifrim. Kein Kosu B'Sefer V'Kanira Shu Sefer Kina Seifrim Lagoin Marashak Mibrod Ve'enoi Matzu Yetzli. So S'dei Chemed says, well, that's the way it's quoted. He just says Kuv Samech. So S'dei Chemed in the parentheses says, that's the way it says, and it's probably the book called Kina Seifrim, from this great rabbi from the city of Brod, but I don't have that book. It says I don't have it. At any rate, Bashmotes, in the supplements, Lenun Zayin Simanun Aleph, Mevi B'Shem HaMishnah LaMelech, he brings down in the name of the Mishnah LaMelech, the Beben Noyach Lo Shayach Bal Yachel. When it comes to Ben Noyach, there is no prohibition of Lo Yachel. Ve'erich Lema'anisoy, and he goes on and he's very elaborate over there. Ukiish Gvurasoi Ad Kan Lashoinoi, and like a strong person. End of quote. Hare, says S'dei Chemed, so behold, what do we have? Farah Divrei Rabbeinu HaMishnah Melech. Indeed, he did see the words of the Mishnah Melech. Eloshein Aloshim Meduktok. The only problem is his exact wording is not so precise. B'mashakosav Bishmoi, what he quotes him, what he writes in his name. Sharhitzvich Talmud Kaniz Koleil. V'divrei Didi Agoin Avbezdin Kihilas Mem Ludash Yishmer Tzur V'chaskim B'sifr Yalkut Agershuni B'chelik Aleph Tak Yud Gimel Amadalit Sif Cotton Yud Beis Miduktokim. Says, however, a different great rabbi, in his book, he writes it that in a precise way, in a very correct way. Shekasav Oid Chakar Mishnah Lamelech, that he writes furthermore that the Mishnah Lamelech is asking Im Shayach Lavd Bal Yachil B'Ben Noyach, whether this prohibition of Lo Yachil, of don't, that you're not allowed to break your commitment, whether that applies to a Ben Noyach, V'im Ben Noyach Muzar L'Kaim Shvuasoy, and whether a Ben Noyach is obligated to keep his vow. Ad Kan L'Shoinoi. That's the end of the quote of this other rabbi, the way he is explaining the Mishnah L'Melech. V'shalos v'tshuvas riva Soif Simon Zakein Hamuva Lahalon B'Sif Kotnachav Beis. And then in another responsa, and he tells exactly where it is. Kosav Bepshitus. He writes very simply, straightforward. Misvara den Afshei, and this is his own logic. Shum Raya, and he brings no proof for what he says. This is just his thought. This is how it makes sense to him. What does he say over there? The Bal Yachel Leisa Ben Noyach. That Bal Yachel does not apply to Ben Noyach. Ayin Sham, take a look over there at how he writes it. He has no proofs, but this is how he concludes that no Bal Yachil for a Ben Noyach doesn't apply. But it's not so simple. What about the question that we said before? How do we accept and offer a sacrifice of a non-Jew? Because maybe there is no Bal Yachil and therefore there's no borrowing. Heishiv Benachlu Yisrael Besiman Ben Ois Yud Beis Ois Yud Gimel. But he answers in the book Nachalo Yisrael the Mukminin HaKorban Al Cheskasoi, that the sacrifice, we establish it, we assume that it has its chazaka, which is a very strong legal terminology for something having its status quo. Deloi nishal al nidroi v'chulu ein sham. I am sorry. I have to make a slight correction. For the past 7 or 8 minutes, I was saying borrowing. That is incorrect. That is a mistake. So, how do they say in court? Take it off the record, or whatever the judge says to the, what do you call the
Greffer, okay, correction. It means to annul the vow. To annul it, nothing to do with borrowing. Non-Jews can borrow property just like Jews can. There's nothing wrong with borrowing, and if you borrowed it, you have liability and responsibility. That's a whole different discussion. It's nothing to do with this. The question is, can a non-Jew annul his vow? Because for the Jew, there's a concept of annulling your vow to get out of your commitment. That can be done properly. Question is, can it be done for the Ben Noach? So, the question is, if you're going to say that a Ben Noach cannot, so how do we bring a sacrifice of a Ben Noach? Maybe, if he could, maybe he annulled his vow, and now this animal is unholy, and he can't bring it into the holy temple. So for that he answers that we don't have to worry about that because there's a chazaka. There's a stronghold assumption that this animal was donated, was offered verbally, he committed to bring it as a sacrifice, and we don't assume that maybe he annulled his vow. So please, that whole piece, strike it from the record, and every time we use the word borrow, I want you to change that for annul. So again, at this point, doesn't to be a clear conclusion whether a Ben Noach is technically transgressing by not keeping their word of a vow that they're making when they're bringing a sacrifice. And therefore it's also not clear whether they can annul that vow or not. But that's the discussion that we've gone through over here. Which brings us up to number Chai, number 18, which is going to be a whole discussion of a technical kosher concept of Jew, for the way it applies for Jews. Does that apply for Ben Noach as well or not? So that should be interesting. So we're going to stop at this point, and until next time, wishing everyone tremendous success in serving God by means of the 7 universal Noachide commandments, and spreading them, teaching them, and the awareness, and most importantly, observing them and making this world the perfect world that it's meant to be, with the complete revelation of our righteous Mashiach now. Thank you.